So, thank you, and could you bring my phone up as well? It's bad enough when I check the phone for what time it is, let alone if I wouldn't. And so you want to open to Matthew 24. Even as I sat in the office in here in the early hours this morning, I was still debating exactly how to present what I've been working on here all week, and started to think about switching something around, but whether it was the Holy Spirit or just me or whatever, I'm going to stick with what I originally planned on. I hope you've all read this at least once, but I think I can read it all in like a little over 3 minutes. So I'm going to try to get through verse 35 today, and I'm just going to go ahead and let's read it together, and then I'll start in. Jesus left the temple and was walking away. This is after what we talked about last week, about how when he dressed down, reamed out the Jewish religious leaders, and then also ended up at the end pronouncing judgment on the nation of Israel. Jesus left the temple after that. He's walking away when one of his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was then sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress or great suffering or great tribulation, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. In those days, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, 'There he is, out in the desert,' do not go out. Or 'Here he is, he's in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For or because as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather." Immediately after the distress or the suffering or the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And at that time the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, You know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now, you're going to need to track with me really, really closely, folks. And there's some things I can't do anything about. I have to use some terms that some of you are going to be familiar with, and you'll be able to understand and follow. Others of you maybe will not. And I won't have time to explain all of them. It's just part of the deal. I'm going to do the best I can, and hopefully everybody can get something out of it. But this is one you really, really have to try to track along with. The differences of opinion about the Olivet Discourse. This is referred to as the Olivet Discourse of Jesus in Matthew chapters 24 and 25. The differences of opinion about these chapters are huge, and I mean huge, within people who claim the Christian faith. And even those who hold a theology that would be like I hold and our fellowship of churches in general hold and many other churches hold, even those that hold a premillennial theology have differences in how we understand what all Jesus was saying here. And certainly there's much bigger differences than between those who hold to amillennial and postmillennial theologies. But I strongly believe that relative to the theology that we are a part of, and a part of the group, not just our fellowship of churches, but other churches as well, we who hold a premillennial theology, I strongly believe that within the general understanding that arises from a premillennial theology, we can live with some of the variations of understanding of these passages. We can live with some of the variations because the general understanding pretty much rises to the top. Now, I do want to make sure once more real quickly. Now am I coming through the speakers? Can you hear me through the speakers now? Does it change too much as I come back over here by the microphone? Sound like I'm coming through? Okay. Okay, I'm just always loud. Okay, well, hopefully, let's do this. Check, test, 1, 2. It doesn't seem like it's coming through real good. How about now? Yes. Now it is. I thought I turned that button on, but apparently I didn't. So what's that? Mistake number 16 today. If you're keeping count. So. Again, I will not argue and fight with people about this stuff, because oftentimes people do. I will certainly engage in sincere discussion. I will defend what I believe and why I believe it. I won't defend it just because, again, I was taught. I will defend it because of what I understand from the Bible, and I will do that respectively respectfully if people want to do that. I don't begin for a moment to pretend to know it all. I don't teach. I don't teach coming from a standpoint I'm right and you're wrong. I don't do that, but I do obviously, hopefully, teach what I am convicted to understand from my studies, and I don't apologize for my convictions. I don't apologize for what I understand from a lot of years of study of this stuff. It's just that I acknowledge I can be as wrong as anybody else, but I'm going to present what I believe with conviction because it's what I have come to believe from my studies. I want you to understand the perspective of the 12, the perspective of Jesus' 12 closest followers in this, when he was having this conversation with them, is very, very important to understand, to think about their perspective. They wondered, he had said about what? That every stone of the temple, they saw this magnificent temple. We talked about in Sunday school, the beautiful gate was 70 feet tall, and these huge stones that built the walls and the foundation and so forth. Jesus said it was going to end up not being one stone on top of another, that it was going to be destroyed. And so these disciples of his, these closest followers, are wondering how the destruction of the temple that he spoke about would relate to the promise of the coming of Messiah into his kingdom and his reign, then, his promised reign over Israel. The context was completely Jewish context. The church wasn't in view at all. The rapture wasn't in view at all. This was all. He was talking to these Jewish followers, and he's saying about the temple's going to be destroyed, and they're wondering, how's that going to tie in to, we know you're the Messiah, how's that going to tie in to your coming into your kingdom, to your rule, to your reign over Israel? How's that going to tie in to the temple being destroyed? They saw the coming of, when they speak of the coming of Jesus, what do we normally think of when we read in this passage about the coming of Jesus? The second coming. Do you understand? They were not thinking about a second coming. Why was that?
He hasn't finished the first coming.
First of all, he hadn't obviously died yet, but even though he hadn't died yet, it's even more than that. They didn't expect him to die. They didn't expect him to go away. They didn't expect him to have to come a second time. And see, we tend to read in the church today, we read these things, and outside of the context, we don't get it. It says the coming of Jesus. Well, of course, it's talking about the second coming. But that's not what the 12 would have been thinking. That's not what the Old Testament prophets thought. They pictured when the Messiah came when he came into his reign and rule as promised Messiah King over Israel, that all the things that would all happen within a relatively short period of time, one after the other. And now these 12 who followed him on earth, who were convinced he was the Messiah, okay, now he's saying the temple's gonna be destroyed, so they're thinking, okay, now how's that gonna fit, with you're still gonna have to come into your rule and reign as king. You're gonna come into your kingdom and rule. How's that gonna tie in with the tearing down, with the destruction of the temple? How are all these events that we understood that the Messiah would come and do, how's that all gonna fit in now here over the near-term future? Because we know you're the Messiah, so how's this all going to work? You see the perspective? That's so important in understanding this stuff. To not look at it from our perspective now. What do I say all the time? The first thing we have to understand about Scripture. Original context. Original context and original audience. You have to understand that first. And then make application, okay, now what's that mean? And what's that mean to me today? The 12 did not talk about, when are you coming? They weren't saying, when are you coming after you go away? They still didn't think he was going away. Remember that. They're thinking it's still going to happen, like maybe even in the next couple years or even less. Maybe even the next couple months. They're thinking, how's this all going to work? If the temple's going to be destroyed, and then how's the rest of your coming into your kingdom going to work here? How's this all going to happen? That's what they're asking. And part of that coming into his kingdom was subduing and conquering the other nations of the world. So the coming of Jesus in the minds of the 12 was not a second coming. They had no concept of that. And they had no concept that he was even going to go to the cross and die at this point. And they asked him what the sign would be that would signal his coming into this predicted position of power and rule. What would be the sign that would be seen that would indicate, okay, now he's coming into this position of authority and power and rule over Israel and even over the nations of the world that was predicted in the Old Testament? And also they were looking for him to tell them, what's the sign going to be about the end of the age? The end of the time period of Gentile domination of Israel, and an end of the age of widespread sin on earth, because again, the Old Testament prophesied a time that once the Messiah would come to rule, that sin would be greatly abated on the earth. And a lot of the passages about that. Again, it's descriptions of what? The millennial kingdom. Descriptions of the millennial kingdom here on earth. This is what they were looking forward to. And this is what they were picturing that Jesus was going to usher in shortly. And this is why they're asking him, how's this going to tie into the destruction of the temple? And what's the timing here? What's the sign going to be to demonstrate that these things are happening? What kind of sign will be seen that will let everybody know, okay, it's here, the time is happening now? That's what they were asking him. Remember, even after Jesus died and rose from the dead, his closest followers still didn't get. What was the last thing they asked him before he ascended into heaven?
Are you now going to restore the kingdom?
Are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They still didn't get that it actually wasn't going to happen for a long time yet. Even after he died and rose again and, had that 40 days of in and out with them, on the earth before he ascended back to heaven, they still didn't get it. And they certainly didn't get it here at this point before he'd even gone to the cross. They actually didn't understand Jesus' answers that he gave here in these chapters until later. Much later. And that's where you really got to try to grasp this. The answers that Jesus gave, the disciples really wouldn't have grasped it much at all, and what they did grasp it would have been wrong. That they didn't understand what Jesus was actually telling them until a lot later. That's something you need to understand. John MacArthur sees 7 indicators in the passage that I read, that the entire message of this Olivet Discourse refers to a time way distant from Jesus. A time of the 70th week of Daniel. The 70th week of Daniel being what we would often call what? The tribulation period. MacArthur says there's 7 indicators in here that says all this stuff described here, not only did it not happen immediately after after Jesus died and rose again and so forth, not only that, none of it still hasn't happened, and in reality, all the things talked about here will not happen until the 70th week of Daniel, until the tribulation period actually begins, in which that hasn't begun yet. He says that these things described, sometimes some people say that they were fulfilled in the destruction of the Jewish temple in AD 70. Some people say a lot of them are being fulfilled even today, like in the church age, that they've been fulfilled here for almost 2,000 years now. MacArthur is one who says he doesn't think any of them have actually, in reality, been fulfilled yet, that they will all not be fulfilled until the tribulation period. Other folks of a premillennial theology think that some of them are being maybe fulfilled now in the church age. Some people think verses, 4 through 8 are already happening now. Other people think verses 4 through 14 are in the process of happening now, and maybe the closer we get to the tribulation, the things will pick up in intensity. But then pretty much all people of premillennial theology believe that once you get to verse 15, which states about what? The abomination of desolation, that once that is revealed, once people see that, then for sure that is in the tribulation period. But you see there's these different views of it. I want you to do this. Go in your Bibles. If you're somebody that writes in your Bible, which I wish you would be, circle these verses that I had read. First of all, circle verse 8. Verse 8. All these are the beginning of birth pains. That means all the stuff from verses 4 through verse 8, all that stuff described, the beginning of birth pains. And again, some people say that is relative to birth pains only start when a woman is going into labor. And once she goes into labor, it ain't long before the child's born. And therefore they say this stuff couldn't have been happening now for almost 2,000 years. That if it's the beginning of birth pains, it's going to happen like right as the tribulation period is beginning to happen, because the birth pains result in birth very quickly, relatively quickly. Not so quickly if you're that woman going through the birth pains, but you get my point. Circle verse 13. These are again the 7 points of John MacArthur. Verse 13, that the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And I can tell already, I'm not even going to get done with what I prepared again. So, the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. What is the end? What does the end mean? Stands firm to the... Some people say just stands firm to the end of their life, and that therefore that could apply to right now. But if you look at the way the phrase "the end" is used here in the passages that I read, it seems to refer to the end when Jesus comes back. And so obviously, people of the church age 1,000 years ago couldn't stand firm until the end, that end, when Jesus came back, because what? He hasn't come back yet. And they died 1,000 years ago, or whatever. So, again, MacArthur feels that this is referring to people in the tribulation period will stand firm to the end. Circle in your Bibles verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so people refer to, the gospel, first of all, the good news of Jesus has not been preached to all nations at this point. And secondly, some differentiate the gospel of the kingdom would include, right now we're preaching salvation in Jesus. During the tribulation period, they will preach the gospel of the kingdom. Yes, salvation in Jesus for the kingdom that He is about to come back and inaugurate, bring in, start. That will be part of the preaching in the tribulation period. Jesus is about to return. This is all about to come to its ultimate conclusion. He is going to return and establish His kingdom here on earth. That will be a part of the preaching during the tribulation. And that would again be why MacArthur and others include it all as happening in the tribulation period. Circle verse 15, which we already talked about, is the abomination that causes desolation. We'll talk about that more. Circle verse 21. Which describes how this time will be a time of, and where it says in my Bible, there will be great distress. Some of you might have in your Bibles in verse 15, great suffering. Some of you might have in your Bibles great tribulation. That's all translation of the same Greek word. And that same Greek word is used 3 different times in this passage that I read this morning. That's where we get the name of this time period, the tribulation. It comes from one of the translations of that Greek word. So whether it's distress, suffering, tribulation, it's referring to what it describes in verse 15, this time of awful suffering and trial and tribulation and distress that has never been seen before in the world and will never be seen again. The worst thing that has ever been seen worldwide since the beginning of time. That should surely tell us that that's referring to the tribulation period, the time of the very end. That is when that will be. But some argue that it's not. Lastly, circle verse 29. Verse 29 says, immediately after the distress of those days, meaning immediately after all this horrible stuff will happen, then the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and all these signs will happen. And it leads into verse 32, which you want to also circle, where it's talking about the fig tree, that like whenever these things start to happen, the end is here. When the fig tree starts sprouting leaves, summer's about here. When all this stuff starts happening, you're going to know that the end is here, the time when Jesus is going to come back and establish His kingdom and conquer the evil nations of the world and Satan and the Antichrist and so forth. And so if you look in your Bibles with those circled, verses 8, 13, 14, 15, 21, 29, 32, if you look, that covers a lot of territory in these passages I read. And there are reasoning, and I gave you some of the reasoning behind it, why they would point to all this stuff happening not until the tribulation period, the 70th week of Daniel, this last 7-year period that the prophet Daniel prophesied so long ago, all this stuff will occur in that 7-year period. And I will share some of this. Again, there are different opinions about it. I shared some of those a little bit earlier. MacArthur himself says that he does believe that there are some things that have been happening in the church age so far, ever since the church started after Jesus ascended back to heaven, then 10 days after that on the day of Pentecost. Ever since then, MacArthur himself says that there are things that are similar to these events described that have happened through the nearly 2,000 years of the church age so far. But obviously, they can't be the stuff here itself right off the bat. If it's happening for 2,000 years, that can't be what's going to happen in this one little 7-year period. It has to be something more significant that is described in here. How unique would it be if it's the earthquakes that have happened over the last 2,000 years? How unique of a time would it be if it's related to the persecution that the church has undergone for the last 2,000 years? Frankly, all the earthquakes, all the persecution, all the things that are described in some of these verses that people say have been happening since the church began, and that's what Jesus was talking about. How is that to rise to the level of stuff that will be worse than anything that has ever been seen in the world and ever seen again? I would submit to you that does not fit. And that's the point. Yes, some of this stuff, people are persecuted now. And maybe that's a sign that's a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the tribulation period, except it's going to be what? A whole lot worse. A whole lot worse. Yes, there are earthquakes in different places these days. And yes, it sounds like we hear about them more. And wars and rumors of wars, yes, that's existed for centuries, right? But when the tribulation period comes, it's going to be unprecedented, like has never been seen before. That's the point of all this, and that's why I would tend to lean toward the belief that all of this stuff that Jesus described won't come to its actual fruition until the 7-year tribulation period. The disciples asked what the sign of Messiah Jesus coming and of the end of the age, and the sign of the end of the age would be. In verse 6, Jesus said the end is still to come. That's after he described the things in verses 4 through 6. In verse 14, he said, then the end will come, after the things that he described in verses 7 through 14. I'm trying to tie down to you this phrase, the end. When is the end? That's part of what we have to understand to be able to understand these things that he's talking about. In verse 14, he said, then the end will come. Again, after the things he described in verses 7 through 14. And especially after the gospel of the kingdom is preached in all the world, which is stated in verse 14. In verse 16, Jesus said, then, after the abomination of desolation has been seen. Has that been seen yet?
No.
We would say no, but believe it or not, there are people who say that the abomination of desolation that causes desolation happened when the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And how they could say that along with all the other things that Jesus said would happen when that happens, or that would happen right after that would happen, how could you say that has already happened? I don't understand it. I really don't. I really would love to talk to somebody that holds that position, who holds it not just because it's what they've been told, but because they would go to the Bible and show me why they believe what they believe. Because I will take them to the Bible and show them why I believe what I believe, and that's what I'm sharing with you right now, and with you there watching the recording. And in verse 16, Jesus said, after the abomination that causes desolation is seen, then those people in Judea should what?
Flee to the mountains.
Flee to the mountains. And in verse 21, he said, then, after the abomination was seen, the greatest unequaled distress, suffering, and tribulation that will ever be seen will happen. So it sounds to me like either the end begins with the abomination that causes desolation and continues to the point where Jesus comes back and conquers the nation, or the end is simply when Jesus actually comes back and establishes his kingdom and conquers the evil of the world and so forth. One of those two, or somewhere in between there, I think, is what he's referring to as the end here when he mentions that multiple different places in these verses that I read to you at the start of this out of Matthew chapter 24. So then what would be the sign of the Son of Man? It doesn't define what the sign of the Son of Man is. What could it possibly, what might it be? Some people think, and I think this is maybe the greatest possibility for it, that if you've heard of the Shekinah glory, like in the temple of the Israelites, oftentimes the glory of God would actually shine in a physical form in the temple, indicating God's presence there with them. Some people believe that the sign of the Son of Man coming to us, who's the Son of Man? Jesus, the Messiah, that the sign of the Son of Man will be this worldwide display of the glory of the Shekinah glory of God in the skies above the entire earth. That will be a sign that will happen, and then, as the account says, and then immediately after that sign shows that people will see Jesus coming in on the clouds. Other people say the sign is actually Jesus himself. That again, somehow worldwide, people will see Jesus coming in the clouds. How that will happen, again, we can only guess, and there's no reason really to do that. All I can say is it'll be really something when it happens. And one of the reasons it'll be really something is, guess what? When Jesus comes at that time, in the clouds, on the clouds, guess who will be coming with him? Us. If you're saved by faith in Jesus, you will be. And that's some pretty cool stuff. Again, premillennial folks overwhelmingly agree that verse 15, the abomination that causes desolation, that when that happens, that has to be the tribulation period. And I'm just baffled how anybody can think otherwise. Again, I think most other people that don't, like amillennial or postmillennial people that have postmillennial or amillennial theology, they believe that by verses 29 and 30, that does speak of the actual second coming of Jesus. They believe that. But look what comes right after that then. If they believe that verses 29 and 30 are describing the actual return of Jesus to the earth, what does it say right after that? It says, immediately after the distress of those days, described in these verses throughout the chapter, and at that time, at the time that the heavenly bodies will be impacted in these ways, the sign of the Son of Man will appear, and then the Son of Man will appear himself. And so how could all that stuff, all the stuff leading up to the coming, if they agree that the coming of Jesus, second coming of Jesus is verses 29 and 30, if all the stuff leading up to it, and then it says immediately then the sign will appear and the Son of Man will come. How could that be stuff that happened in AD 70 then? If it's immediately after that stuff's done, how could it be then that Jesus hasn't come back yet? Again, I'm not sure what their explanations are to that. And one commentary that I was reading some this week that the guy holds that view, he didn't really explain anything. He did not explain how that could be. I don't get it. In verse 15, surely Jesus was speaking about the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy that there would be a future leader who would, similar to what ancient ruler? Who this future evil ruler, the Antichrist, the beast, the little horn of Daniel, that someday he would come and do something similar but much worse than what evil ruler of long ago? Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jewish temple at that time. But when the Antichrist comes, he's going to do something like that, but much, much worse. And obviously it couldn't have been Antiochus that Jesus was talking about, because Antiochus Epiphanes did that before Jesus was on the earth. And I know for some of you, a lot of this is just confusing, and I get that. And so if it kind of gets confusing, you just got to kind of keep backing off and trying to pick up the best of the major points you can get. But this is why we learn this stuff. So you got to learn some of the basics before you can go any further. Because if you try to learn the deeper stuff before you learn the more basic stuff, it's just going to confuse you. What do I got here? Well, what I wanted to finish up with then, I don't know. I can start. I just have a few comments then on these verses themselves. There's probably no way, in a timely way, I'm going to be able to do it and read all the verses again and give you the comments. I really don't. I've struggled with this. Maybe I'll just start through. I hate to quit in the middle of it, but maybe I'll just start through, and once it gets too late, we'll just have to pick up there next week. That's all I know to do. Look at verses 1 through 3 again. I'm going to have to go fast. You can have these notes. If you want a copy of these notes, I can give them to you. You just got to let me know. Again, chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. Jesus left the temple, was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to the buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked. I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. And then as Jesus was sitting at the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And I will tell you again, Jesus had rebuked the Jewish religious leaders, what we looked at last week in chapter 23. He had pronounced judgment on the entire nation of Israel. And now he says that the mighty temple was going to be demolished. And as I told you earlier, the 12 are saying, okay, how's the destruction of the temple going to fit into all the rest of the stuff you're going to do here shortly? Because they were convinced he was going to come into his kingdom very, very soon. And Jesus' answer to that is what's recorded then from verse 4 all the way through the end of chapter 25. Let's go to verses 4 through 8. Again, I'm going to fly here. Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in various places. All these are what? The beginning of the birth pangs. Now, let me tell you right off the bat, Jesus spoke here in the second person. That means he was saying, you will see this, you will see that. Don't be deceived by that. Jesus was speaking prophetically. He wasn't seeing, and this is where this really screws people up. But there are other examples of this in the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 33, Zechariah chapter 9 are two of the best examples I found, that where the prophet actually, he spoke in the second person. He said, you will see this, you will do that, but he was talking about a future generation. I and others are completely convinced that that's what Jesus was doing here, but that's what makes this so confusing for so many people. He's saying here, you will hear, you will see, all that kind of stuff, but he was talking about this future generation who would see it. And the disciples then, I don't think, understood that, and I don't think they probably understood it for a long time, and I'll guarantee you a lot of people today don't understand that. But Jesus was speaking prophetically. He was speaking about a future generation. And when he talks about a generation a little bit later on, that generation would not die until they saw all this stuff, he wasn't talking about the generation of the apostles. He was talking about this future generation that actually sees all this stuff happening, including the abomination that causes desolation, the miraculous works of the sky, the shaking of the heavenly bodies, and all that stuff. They will witness that. The people of that age, that generation, will see all that stuff. I know that's confusing, but that is the gist of this. Jesus was speaking prophetically, referring when he was saying you, and you will see, and you will hear, and all that kind of stuff. It's for the people that will see and hear it then. And remember later on with the abomination of desolation, it says, let the reader understand, right? Let the reader understand. That's referring to when this got wrote down, when Jesus was talking to them, they weren't reading it, right? He was verbally telling them. But then it says, let the reader understand. Meaning people who read about this someday, about what Jesus said. And what people will be the readers that should understand. What people?
The ones that are in that.
The ones that will be in the generation of the tribulation period. When they read this and they see what's going on around them, and when they see the abomination that causes desolation set up in the temple, then they can know they're in that time, and oh my word, they are going to face the horrors of the tribulation period. And Jesus says when they see that abomination of desolation set up in the temple, they should head for the hills, right? That's what this is about. And I know, again, I get it. That's a lot. All the things listed in these verses are the beginning of birth pains. I talked about, again, real labor pains don't happen until the woman is ready to go into the birthing process. And the whole analogy here would seem to suggest that even these things in these first verses, when they start happening, they're just the beginning of birth pains, but it means the birthing is coming. They're just going to be the beginning of the pains of the tribulation period, but the tribulation period is at hand. Just like the birth of the baby is at hand when a woman goes into labor. Even though it might be a little while, but it's coming. It's starting the birthing process. And when this stuff that we're reading even in these first verses start, I believe the tribulation period will be starting. And I think these first things that are described probably will happen in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. Okay, skip down verses 9 through 14. Then, meaning after this stuff happens, then you'll be handed over to be, and again, that word persecuted there, some of you may have handed over to suffering or tribulation. That's that same Greek word again. Can be translated tribulation, suffering, persecution, whatever. That's that same Greek word. You'll be handed over to that, put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith, betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear, deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Verse 9 starts with then. Again, it seems to be saying the tribulation period is progressing. Events are getting harsher. Probably this will correspond to the moving past the midpoint of the tribulation. What did the prophet Daniel say would happen at the midpoint of the tribulation? Well, besides the abomination that causes desolation, but that would be in association with what? Relative to the Antichrist in Israel. Come on, somebody knows. That the treaty will be broken. Prophet Daniel said that the Antichrist will set up a treaty with Israel at the beginning of the tribulation. And for the first 3.5 years, he will be in this peace treaty with them. And Steve, remember a while back, we were talking about the peace thing and everything. And yeah, I really do think it can be that, referring to that first 3.5 years of the tribulation in the situation you were talking about. Israel will basically be at peace. The Antichrist will defend them and so forth for that first 3.5 years. But then at the midpoint, the prophet Daniel says he will turn on them, break the treaty, and then it will be hell for the Jews. And he will desecrate the temple, the abomination that causes desolation, and he will pursue the Jews to kill as many of them as he can kill. He will seek to actually exterminate them. He will come after them with a vengeance. Wickedness will get even worse. Many will turn away from God to vainly try to save their earthly lives. The good news of Jesus will be preached. That most likely will include, again, the news about the Messianic kingdom that is soon to arrive. And those who are able to survive to the end of the tribulation and stand firm in their faith, they will be the mortal human beings that enter the millennial kingdom here on earth. And I don't have time to dwell on this stuff anymore. I just have to touch it and keep moving. Some people think that the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom to the whole world ties to Revelation 14, 6, and 7, which refers to God sending an angel to go to all the corners of the earth and preach the gospel of God. Some people think that's what this is describing here, that the preaching of the gospel that's referred to here that will go to every nation in the world at this time doesn't actually even refer to just human gospel spreaders, but it refers to this angel mentioned in Revelation chapter 14, going around and preaching in all corners of the earth. And then the end will come, referring again either to that second 3.5 year period of the tribulation that will be hell on earth, or maybe referencing again the very end of it whenever Jesus actually returns, destroys the Antichrist armies and all the unbelievers, sends Satan to the abyss, sends the beast and the false prophet to the lake of fire. All that stuff then will happen. That will at least really pick up the pace, and the final phase, the final 3.5 years will take place then. Verses 15 through 25. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back and get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women, nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in the winter or on the Sabbath. You didn't think I could read this fast? Now I'm sweating. For then there will be great distress, great tribulation, great suffering, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe, for false Christs and false prophets will appear. They'll perform great signs and even miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you so ahead of time. And so, as I said, abomination that causes desolation. Revelation talks about how an image of the Antichrist, the beast, will be set up in the Jewish temple. People will be called to worship the Antichrist, the beast, in the Jewish temple instead of God, where in the Holy of Holies that represents the very presence of God, a picture of the beast will be set up there, and people would be commanded to worship that beast. That's the abomination that causes desolation. And after that point again, he says, if you're seeing that, go. Run for the mountains. It's your only hope. And the prophet Zechariah says 2/3 of the Jews will be killed. There will only be 1/3 of them that will escape. And the only reason they'll escape is because it says God will supernaturally protect them. 2/3 of them will die. That's why Jesus said, when you see this starting to happen, don't run right now, and you'll have to hope for the best, because again, prophet Zechariah says 2/3 of them will die. Don't miss where it says false messiahs and false prophets will be doing demonically empowered signs and miracles. Yes, miracles can be induced to happen by other than just the power of God. Not to the degree that God can. God is infinitely more powerful, and God could stop them from doing it, but He will allow this. And miracles can actually be done by demonic power, by satanic power. They are powerful enough to do miraculous things. And that's a sermon for a whole nother day. But even just because something miraculous seems to have been done by someone, you better be careful that all the pieces fit together, that it's an act of God. Because if it's something that involves something that does not seem to be kosher with God's deal, it very well may be satanic. And you've got to be very careful with that. No time to talk about that anymore. I'm going to keep flying here. I think we can get there. One more page, 26 through 31. So if anyone tells you there he is out in the desert, don't go out. Here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For, why? Why, during that time, why, if somebody says there's the Messiah, right? He's right in here. He's right in our building here. Why should they not believe it? Jesus said, why not? Verse 27, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. What do you know when you see buzzards circling?
Something's dead.
There's something dead, right? There's all kinds of theological explanations for this verse about the vultures. I think it's as simple. What's Jesus' context here? He's saying, when this time comes, don't believe people that tell you, oh, the Messiah's in there and nobody knows about it. Oh, the Messiah's out in the desert there teaching, but nobody knows about it. What's he saying here? When I come, there'll be no mistaking it. Everybody will know when I come. If somebody's telling you I'm here and you don't know it, they're full of baloney. Stay away from them. That's what he's saying. And I think he's saying when the vultures are there circling, you know there's a corpse there, it's the same thing. When I come, you're going to know I'm here. That's not going to be able to be mistaken when I return. And verse 29 then says, immediately after the distress or the tribulation or the suffering of those days, all this stuff that's just been described, right after that, immediately after that, what will happen? The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And at that same time, when all this stuff's happening to the heavenly bodies, unprecedented chaos in the universe. Can you even imagine what this is going to be like on earth? For those that will be here when this is happening. Chaos in the universe, in the heavenly skies. The planets, the stars, the sun, the moon. At that time, verse 30 says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and with great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds from one end of the heavens to the other. Again, these signs of his coming immediately after all this bad stuff, immediately after this terrible, unprecedented time of tribulation, a stunning, unprecedented disturbance of the universe will take place. Sun, moon, planets, stars will literally be shaken. They will be disrupted beyond any imagination. See prophecy about that. Isaiah chapter 13, chapter 34, Joel chapter 2, Joel chapter 3. And Luke chapter 21, it says that the nations of the earth will be in disbelief, they will be in anguish, they will be perplexed, bewildered, shocked. The seas will roar, the waves will crash. I wonder if that won't have to do with the disruption of the planets. Like the moon, you know the effect that has on waves and all that kind of stuff. It is going to be chaos. And it says in Luke that people will faint in terror, in paralyzing fear of what they see happening and what that must mean. Whatever the sign of the Son of Man will be, again, I think it's best likely to be a worldwide display of the Shekinah glory of God. Whatever that will be, it will appear. And then immediately, the Son of Man will return to this earth, visible to everybody somehow. Don't know how, but the way all this other stuff's being described, all I can say is wow. Wow. And the nations of the world will mourn probably because they realize their doom has come as they see the Son of Man coming with power and great glory. And Jesus will send his angels, get this part, Jesus will send his angels to gather those around the world who came to faith in him during the tribulation period and yet survived all the horrors, all the stuff that the book of Revelation describes will happen when, I forget what the percentages of the earth will die during the tribulation period, but the ones that survive and the ones who have placed faith in Jesus during the tribulation period, this angel will gather them all up. We believe he will also gather up. We believe this is when the believers of the Old Testament, pre-cross days, will be raised from the dead. We would believe that the people that came to believe in Jesus during the tribulation period but were killed, that they will rise from the dead. And all these, the angel will gather all these up for the purpose of entering into Jesus' millennial kingdom. As he's coming back, the angel will gather all these to, with him, enter into this millennial kingdom. And I'm leaving out one group that hasn't been gathered up yet. And who will that be? Us, the church. But the angel won't have to gather us up because what?
We're with Jesus.
We're with Jesus, coming with him. Huh? Riding on white horses, dressed in white linen, it says in Revelation chapter 19. That's symbolic, and I'm not preaching that today, but that's what it says, and that's referring to us, who will be coming with him as he comes. Last verses. I'm not even going to read them. I'm just going to say, it talks about the fig tree. I already talked about that. When the leaves come out, you know summer's about here. He said, when the people of this generation see all this stuff, you can count on it. It's going to happen. I'm coming. When all this stuff happens. And one thing I will say is verse 34 says, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. He's talking about the generation what? That sees them. The generation that is alive during the tribulation period. He's saying they will see all these things happen. They will all, and for that to happen, first of all, to happen in one generation narrows the time frame down, right? But what it's going to be is it's all going to happen in 7 years. The 70th week of Daniel, the prophetic 70th week of Daniel. 69 of those weeks have already happened. There's one more to go. That's going to be this 70th week of Daniel, the period of tribulation, and the people then will see all this stuff happen that Jesus just talked about here. Have you made room for Jesus in your life? By the way, I made it. I'm late, as always, but I didn't think I was even going to get close, and I know I flew, but do you have room for Jesus in your life? If you have, you will be a part of that amazing gathering of people when Jesus comes back. If you have placed Jesus as first in your life, accepted him in saving faith, you will be one of those riding on white horses, dressed in white linen. You won't literally be on a horse, so if you're afraid of horses, don't worry. It's symbolic language to say you will be coming in triumph with Jesus to reign with him here on the earth for 1,000 years. I don't know what you'll do. I figure, Barb, you'll be in charge of talking to somebody, probably. I think that's what you'll reign on. But anyway, you will be a part of that in Jesus' kingdom here on the earth for 1,000 years. Have you any room for Jesus today? If you don't, you will not. And if you don't until you die, if you don't make room for Jesus till you die, you will not be a part of that gathering of beings to enter into that millennial kingdom, both mortal human beings, from survivors of the tribulation period, to the saved of all the ages to that point. If you're not making room for Jesus, and if you don't before you die, you will not be among that group. And you will be among another much sadder group. And that's a topic for another day, but the closing song is, Have You Any Room for Jesus? 478. 478. Please stand as we sing. I may need CPR.